Okay. So let's share. So Tom, in your impression, how much of what I'm covering here with respect to the Flask and SQLite 3 and the Pee-wee ORM, how much of that is overlap with what's been covered so far?
Pretty much zero, other than like SQLite. They've just entered are being introduced to like that concept within Django. But as far as Flask, nope. And Pee-wee, nothing.
Okay.
Yep. So this is all new.
Okay, cool. That's good to know. It's good to know. So yeah, my exposure to Pee-wee personally is very small as well. So hopefully that'll help you guys out too. So right, let's continue where we left off here. In where did we leave off? Not there, but here. Yeah. So what have we done here so far? What's actually running? Yeah, SQLite is the database. Flask. I don't know much of either Flask or Django, but Flask is like a very simple kind of implementation of what Django also does. So if you know what a Raspberry Pi is, you can think of that as Flask, and then Django is like the MacBook compared to the Raspberry Pi. So we're not going to get into Flask very heavily at all, and we're not going to get into Pee-wee heavily at all, besides just kind of putting them in their respective categories and genres for reference. The point is to get something simple enough that we can use it to make changes, and we want to use Git to make changes. So let's all try as hard as we can not to get hung up on Flask or Pee-wee or SQLite, because that won't be the point of this class, right? The point is Git and collaborating with Git. So, but you have to use Git to collaborate with on complex things, relatively complex things. So the idea is that this is a difficult enough project for you to have to use Git and have to collaborate, and then that will prepare you for like the really complex stuff you do when you do your capstone projects at the end of this cohort. Which is like every time I see the end of a cohort, it blows my mind, like the stuff people come up with. So hopefully, you can get a foundation and get enough to prepare you to do the things that you'll need to do with Git and GitHub, and understand where Git is in that space of GitHub and collaboration and project. Carrying your project forward with tasks and whatever workflow you choose to use. My small piece here is to, when something goes off the rails with your Git part of your big capstone project, you'll at least have a place that will keep you moving forward, and you won't have to wonder what happened to your code and where it went and things like that. So anyway, that said, let's go back to looking at what here is in the repo that we're going to change. So as I said, the pieces are, Flask and Pee-wee. A couple of requirements here. We're using YAML files, so we pull in PyYAML to read something like that config thing that we copied over. That's a very simple YAML statement. And then there's this thing called IPython, which is, I don't know if you've run into that before. Tom, have you guys used IPython?
Yeah, we just Did it yesterday,
Okay.
but they're still probably not very familiar with it.
That's fine. I'm not either, but its coolness, I'll show you what it's, well, you probably just seen it yesterday, but I'll use that a little bit to dig into what's going on in this code. Anytime you can, break in a place in your code that's having trouble, you have great power at your disposal to figure out what's going on and what to do next. So I'll show some of that, but that's what that's in there for. So the code itself, app.py. Actually, let's start with the thing that we ran. So the run Flask web server. It runs main.py after it gets the environment going. So main.py. I am told that this, based on the interweb and Googling around, that what I've put in place here looks a little bit like what Django is going to look like. So maybe that will help. I don't know. I don't know Django, so I won't know enough. But you can see here at least what we're bringing in order to run. So, the app.py brings in a couple of variables that it uses, and it goes down here and sets up tables with create tables if it needs to. And kind of it modifies the path that it uses to find modules and files so that it can say things like import views, which is a file here. I'm not going to cat it right now, but there is a file that it brings in right here that this sort of thing helps it to go find those without much trouble. So it just modifies your path inside Python. And then finally, you bring in some things that tell you about the database and the table in your database. So Pee-wee is an example of something called an object relational mapper. And if you haven't used much of databases and code, then it doesn't mean much. But once you get into using databases and code and trying to get things in and out of your database, then it starts to mean a lot more, because you can write things like I just wrote when I looked at the database directly. I ran SQLite 3, and I looked at the database, and I ran a select star from the data. It's called tag is the table name. That gets quickly a little bit ugly in your code if you have to write SQL language inside of another language, because then what comes out doesn't look like something that you could use easily with code. It's just a bunch of text in this context. So a mapper will take something that you do, and of course you can't run code from SQLite, not unless it's SQL code, but in your Python program, you can use Python, and the mapper pulls it into Python objects. And then you can use Python list commands and Python code to look at this data, and it's arranged in a way that can be manipulated with your code instead of having to be converted by you. It's the other way you'd have to do it if you didn't have this mapper to do it for you. So Pee-wee is an example of that. It's an adapter to basically let you pull in your data, and it decouples you from what kind of database you have on the back end. So, for instance, Pee-wee can use SQLite. It can also use PostgreSQL. If you want to use a Postgres database, it can also use MySQL. And so all you have to do is switch out the adapter, and you can still use Pee-wee and not have to really change your code much, if at all, when you are working with the data that comes in from that adapter. So it gives you a lot more flexibility. So that's Pee-wee. Flask. Let's see what Flask does here. So if we are in app.py. Let's take a look at that. Command K, clear the screen. So we pull in Flask here. You don't see actually a whole lot of Flask yet, besides coming up with a Flask object. And you can see us putting a little bit of config into Flask here. Notice that's where our config.yaml comes into play. So we're going to be able to look at things. We're going to access the contents of this via this app.config line here. And then you see the database coming in here. And that's more the Pee-wee side of things than it is the Flask side of things. But if you recall, we did pull in the view, that view file. So let's look at that view file. That's going to be more Flasky stuff. View.py. So here's where Flask starts to come into our picture. It lets us do things like this to define when we type into our URL bar in our up here. Actually, that's not the one I'm using. It's this one. So this maps to things like slash up here, or if you look a little further down in here, the next route /tags. Then you begin to map your URLs to actual code in your web app. Now this won't actually work if I type this, because notice this is a post method. So when I type this in the browser, and you just send that's a get method. So Flask was like, I don't know what that is. This is for a post. You just typed a get. So it doesn't actually route to this code. Let's go back here. So that's one thing Flask gives you. You've also noticed I imported request and redirects. So Flask lets me do this. It handles going back to the back to where I went when I first came to this place, or not necessarily there. It handles going back to a totally different place, back to slash. Request. Do I use request in here? I mean, request, yeah, I do. I don't use it explicitly, but it lets me. Yes, I do. Here it is. So it lets me get hold of things that I've passed from the browser. It lets me get hold of parameters. So when I start to use this, I'll be able to, type in a tag here. And then when I hit enter, then that is going to be a post request. And then that is going to come back here to this route. And then that thing that I entered will be picked off of the request and put in this request object so that I can use it. So there's some Flasky things happening there for me as well. And notice all this is inside of a get or create. So that is something that is, again, that's the Pee-wee part coming in play, the ORM that lets me make this. It makes this instance of the tag, basically makes a row in the table for me of a tag. So there's Pee-wee happening right here. So this all stuff up here is stuff you would never want to write in real life. Reason being that it creates HTML, but it doesn't use any of the sort of web app or framework kind of disciplines or methods to do that. It just writes straight HTML. And as you can see, it works, but it's incredibly ugly and hard to work with. So you'll run into that in some of the changes that you make, because you're going to be trying to pick through a whole raft of HTML. You see this variable going into this variable, and then this gets put in down here, and that gets inserted in where the %s's are over here. And then there's some tags HTML that comes first, and that gets passed into this string here that gets inserted into this other %s. So it's incredibly messy. It's bad. It's a prime example of why you guys need to go change it very soon. So let's see, what else is there to cover here? Environment, yes. So I'll skip a little bit of the IPython right here until we actually use it, because you just touched that. So let's talk about environment though. So there are at least two different ways that the word environment is used in this app here. One of them is in the command line on Bash. It's the kind of the context of your Bash shell is called the environment. So for instance, if I type env, I'm going to type a command K and then env, and that's a bunch of environment variables. So most of what somebody says when they say what's in your environment, for instance, is going to be this kind of thing. It's going to be a bunch of variables like that. And some of those variables you set, and some of them you change that they're already set, but you would change, like the path, for instance. Some of them are just put there and you don't hardly ever touch them, like home, hardly ever mess with home, or log name, or term, describes your terminal. And this is there even if you're in something like VS Code, or if you're using Visual Studio on Windows. Windows also has a similar notion of environment as Unix and Linux does. It's very, very important if you're going to do deployments to something like Heroku or Doku, or some container-based technology. They will have a notion of environment, and that's going to be often how you put your settings and your secrets into that environment, is you set an environment variable. So notice here this virtual env. That's something that happens when we typed source, this bin activate. So for instance, if I type deactivate, that takes me, notice it takes me out of the environment. There's that venv is no longer there. So if I do an env again, that virtual env variable is gone. So that's one way that my environment has changed. You may also notice my path is different as well. So that the Python virtual environment functionality changes my Bash environment. So if I go back in with the source, env bin activate, do env again. Notice what's come onto the beginning of my path. So now my path has this path to my venv directory now. So if I look at what's in venv/bin, all this stuff is here that it looks at first. So remember when I said we could type Python, we don't have to type Python 3. This is why we could do that, is because the getting into the virtual environment has changed my path, and now when it's looking for Python, it looks here first. It doesn't look in all these other places first. So if it goes to those other places, it might find a Python that's a Python 2. But because I've said no, and this goes on the front of my path, look here first. And now the Python that we find is going to be this one down here under venv/bin. And that Python, I'm 100% sure is going to be Python 3. And we notice we can also type Python 3 if we want, because that's there as well. But either way, we're going to get the same Python that we're going to get the one that's in our Python virtual environment that we've activated, because we've changed our environment. So that's the bash environment. Okay, that's thing one, environment. The thing two is that environment is also used to talk about the deployment configuration that you're in. So you'll hear people talk about your development environment, your UAT environment, your production environment, test environment. So that's kind of a similar concept, but it's not exactly the same as what I just discussed. So you may have, like in this code here, do I have a good example? I've got a bit of a fake edit. If you're looking at app.py, it's a little confusing because it uses an actual bash environment variable to talk about a deployment environment. So it's muddling two different concepts by using one to define the other, in a sense. But you can see here that this code, at least that it defaults to an environment called development. And development is, if you go a little bit further down here to see where this thing is used, Flask and env, it references this config, the config database.yaml. So I'm going to get out of here and go down into config. So this is notice this is a directory. This is not config.yml. This is a config directory. And it has a YML file, but it's a database YML, not a config YAML. So it's a config specifically for the database. Well, and so this is the other notion of environment, right? So this is basically a section in a config that defines what each of these deployment postures look like. Now, each one is very simple now because it's, there's only one setting, basically what the database name is. But even here, you can see that, the value of separating out, your databases. So you're not using the same database for all of development, test, UAT, and production. You're using different databases. So, and if you have different resources you're bringing in, different services, perhaps, you want to maybe if you're writing, you're writing data to a service, you don't want to write your test data into production. So this is a place where you can define your deployment in terms of what, where you're working, whether you're in development, test, UAT, or production. So that's another similar but different concept of environment. If you're in DevOps, maybe 60% of DevOps is knowing how your bash environment works and knowing how your deployment environment is set up. And 80% of the trouble you run into in DevOps is not understanding how that happens. So knowing how environment variables work is critical. Wish I had more time to get into that, but that's a different class. All right, so one more pass through app.py here. Let's get in the right directory, cd ... So we pull in this development value through this os.env, which you can get the path here if you wanted. If you put path in here, you could look at the path if you needed to. So very, very handy for all kinds of access to your environment. AWS access keys, secrets, client IDs. Those are the kinds of things you would put in your environment to be pulled into your code. So, okay. What else do we want to cover here? I mean, we've already talked about the Python virtual environment, so there's a third one for you. Got important to keep them distinguish between them. So we looked at routes already, how the routes are defined a little bit in that views.py. What code retrieves tags from the database? Let's see if we look at views.py. Any volunteers to tell me what code retrieves tags from the database in here?
It's going to be the
get
first
method
function.
So it's in the get method is where it lives. What line, what statement does the actual retrieval? Would you think? It's not really a fair question because we haven't looked at the code that does it yet, but just curious if anybody has a guess. So what does it is this guy right here. So this is an example of the ORM action that we're talking about. So the that tag class gets imported here from this tag file, which is under models. So this is Pee-wee in action here. Define your base model, and that's where you tell it what database you're pointing at, and then this class here, this tag class, corresponds to a table in the database. So you define that and define your attributes, which correspond to the columns in the database, the fields. And then because you've imported Pee-wee from up here, you've imported everything from Pee-wee up here, then you can say things like select on that class. And down here, when we're modifying the database, you can say things like get or create, and that comes in from the Pee-wee package. So that's what's happening in here. Right, so that's where the code comes from. And you can kind of see a little bit of the nicety of ORMs, because if you didn't say this, you'd have to say select star from tag, and then you'd have to take all that text that comes back and convert it into something you could use. And here, this tags variable is right here, and it's basically a list that's getting passed into this this map command right here, or this map method. So that's Python. That's just native Python you're using to manipulate the data that came from your SQLite database through this ORM layer, and specifically the SQLite adapter, declared in that layer. And now you can just do Python with it and move on. So I think we touched on this already. What code inserts tags into the view, or did we? No, we didn't. So if you look at the view, there are these tags here just under the picture. So what code? I'll give you a hint. It's in views. What is the code that creates that tag list? That you see. You can inspect it.
tags
Like
HTML variable.
Yeah, you see it's got a first tag and then a BR and the second tag and a BR, a third tag and a BR. So yeah, here's where it gets fed in. Here's the BR. Here's this anonymous function that converts X to a name plus BR. And here's another highlight of what an ORM does for you. You can just reference that row, because this is a list of rows that you get back with a select star. So now you can reference the attributes on that row with just the dot notation. So you've got the name attribute, you've got, I think we have created at, updated at. There's ID, of course, but you don't really need to use that in this app here. But yeah, that's a very relatively straightforward way to get at that, that field in that row and use it in your code. So yeah, then it just takes those and joins them all together. So it, you don't have to have this necessarily, but it looks nicer if you are printing out this HTML. And then you get you do have to join them. So you could put a blank there or something, or empty string if you wanted to. But yeah, that creates that list. Image path. Where does the image path come from? Here's the image, right? The NASA.gov. Beautiful, beautiful solar flare. How does that path get in there?
From the config file.
Yes. Yeah, no, remember in app.py, we defined this app config. And because we used YAML to read in that that config.yaml, now we can refer to elements in that YAML. And this is cool because it could be arbitrary, arbitrary structure. Whatever's in the YAML will now be available to you through this app config.config through the PyYAML package. So yeah, we can pull that in, and then I don't know if you noticed here, there's this % notation with the string that we used. So you can basically substitute variables into your string using %s here and here. And that just picks off the, we have 3% s's. So the first %s, you're going to get the first argument here, which is that image. Second one here, and between these two divs here is going to be the tags HTML. It's going to go in there, and then the last one is going to get the form HTML. So yeah, there's the image, and then the tags, and then the form is going to be this guy down here at the end. So that's pretty much the website. I mean, there's the only other thing that's going on here is, if we actually run it, so I don't get an error. So then run, excuse me. So if I type return here, then we get another tag that comes in, because this guy, inspect this guy down here, is inside a form, and you might not be able to see it very clearly, but the method is post on that form. So that goes back to our app.py, or I'm sorry, this is in the views.py, where our route is a post on /tags. So there, that's how that all happens there. So again, I hope this, this isn't getting off track too much. I want to keep the actual technology of the site simple enough that we can load it into our heads and then understand it well enough, at least well enough to change it. We don't have to come up with new GWiz functionality. We just need to be able to talk about changes to it. So Image path code, we did that. Code stays a tag. Straight SQL, we talked about that a little bit. We kind of talked about the view. So what, anybody have any opinions about what we would do differently here in this code to clean it up? I know that's also a very general, unfair question, but it does look very messy to me. Like,
At least have a separate HTML file.
yeah,
Maybe.
exactly. Yes, yeah, put all that somewhere else somehow. and you know, so you can read the thing instead of having all these different concepts going on in one big file. Let's do one thing here. See this this embed statement. So let's go in there and comment that out, or uncomment it, I should say. Pardon me for using Vim. I can probably use code here. Let me see what happens if I fire that up. Hey, it works. All right, so do it this way. What did I just do? Clearly, I don't know this at all.
You just opened a separate tab, so you can close that getting
There we
started.
go. All right. There it goes. Okay, so now save that. Let's go into run Flask web server. Okay. And now this is going to come on the show tags. So if I hit this, just refresh the page. Oh, it says embed is not defined. Okay, so let's fix that. Let's use code to fix that. Probably because I haven't imported IPython, so, or embed. So I need something like this in here. So let's see if that helps. Okay, try it again. Familiar internal server error. All right. So now notice my browser is paused because it's waiting on the response, but it hasn't been given back yet by my server. That's because my server is paused on this line. So let's see, I don't know this very well at all. There is context here that I can look at. So let me just go look at the code here in my repo. So I'm right here. So I can look at things like tags. Like if I just say tags, okay, it's a class. I have to like go into the class. So I can maybe, is there a count method? Okay. What can I do? Tags, is there a tags out first method? Can I reference it? Okay. So maybe tags out zero.name. Okay, that'll work. So I can basically type whatever code I would type, you know, or whatever code I would use in my program here as well. I've already defined tags HTML, so I could look at that. It should be easy. That's just a string. Okay, so yeah, there it is. Form HTML. So there's what's going to happen there. If I want to say, gosh, I wonder if all this stuff is going to turn out the way I hope, I can just copy that and paste that in here to see what that looks like. So that's what's going to be that's going to evaluate to. So you get the idea. You can try different things in the context of this code that may or may not be working the way you expect, and see what's going on, and see what variables are actually set to, and you know, almost just write code, you know, that you really want by testing it out here in this particular context, which, you know, would be hard. It would be a longer route to set that all up and just keep trying and running the program again, especially if your program, your app or whatever has a long setup time and a long initialization time. So this is a great handy shortcut very often. And then you can just get out of there and you know, go on with your program. And if you haven't timed out, then you're going to get the response back to your browser. So, so I just said quit to go on.
If you made changes to variable, like if you assigned if you did an assignment operation there, would that change the look and feel of the web page?
Let's try it. So here we go. We're going to refresh. I'm going to stop. So what if I said like tags HTML equals this instead, like that?
Yeah, something like that.
I'm going to say quit. Now I would have expected that to work, but it didn't. Let me try
Okay.
again. Why wouldn't that have worked?
What about just changing one of the tag names?
I'm sorry?
What about just like try and change one of the tag names to get something just a little bit
Oh, I
more
see.
simple?
In the yeah, so let's try that. So tag 0.name maybe.
Yeah.
Something like here. Let's see if I can quit. Now that is interesting.
So it's only keeping it while the IPython is live.
Yeah, and actually that's very surprising to me. I would have expected that to have made a difference here. So that
Can you step instead of quitting?
no, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I haven't figured out how to do that if you can. So maybe someone could prove me wrong there. That would be awesome. I'd love to know how to do that if that's possible. But at this point, the embed is where you're at, and of course you can move the embed around. But that is a surprising outcome to me. I would have thought that the changes
Is
would be
it
consistent.
because the embed is after the form HTML?
Well,
Or-
I would think that if the embed were before, then it gets whatever is there is either not defined or it's going to be overridden by what comes next. But that is if it doesn't do, maybe this time. Maybe I may be exposing my severe lack of knowledge of Python at this point. Although, you know what? Okay, here's one theory. Tags has already been used here, so that's going to explain why this wouldn't change. But I would have expected tags HTML to be different because that gets used down here. Unless I mistyped it somehow. So that what I would expect to be. I wonder if I'm getting some kind of caching effect. Let me try as Command Shift R. Yeah, I don't know. It is a mystery to me what's going on there. So
Sorry for taking us down a rabbit hole. I appreciate the diversion though.
yeah, I mean, yeah, now I gotta go. Now I gotta go learn something. But yeah, so use embed, I use it a lot. It's I can actually, accomplish a whole lot more with Python than I could without it, little as I know about it. So let's see, what time is it? 10:40. So let's move towards some other sort of exercise here. This about takes us through everything that I wanted to look with the pre-work. This link down at the bottom, I will say, was broken when I slacked this page, but it's fixed now. So this is pretty much, if you know this, if you know what's on this page, you're going to have a real good sort of start on the bash, using the bash shell effectively. With that said, this stuff down here is a lot to take in. We covered a little bit of the path variable just now. We touched a little bit on environment variables. We didn't do hardly any of this besides using a command here and there. And then the this whole area of knowledge with standard IO and out and standard error. That's really starting to get into the forest of Linux and Unix. So apologies for that link being broken. But the good news is you've got 2 weeks from now until the next class. So if you want to get into that forest a little bit, I would recommend it. It's very powerful. Let's see. So between now and the next like 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to transition over into, what are we at here? So here's back to here, the pre-work. The syllabus is, so what we're going to do is we're going to take the session 1 handout and use it to cover the concepts in the session 1 syllabus. So what I'm looking at here is the syllabus part. And at the bottom of the syllabus is the handout link, I believe. Yeah, session 1 student handout. So it might be helpful for you to have both of those open when we're going through the material. So if you want to try this unpacking the Git objects, this is assuming you've gotten your repo here already. And what we've done is pull down a repo, and Git does some optimization and compressing even more than it already does when you push something up, so that when you pull it back down, there's the database is sort of consolidated into one file when normally it would be spread out across many files and directories. So this section right here basically just pulls those objects back out of that one pack file into the layout that lets us kind of look around and see how things are set up inside of the Git repo. So that's that bin/unpack objects. And I'm just going to run that to make sure I've not. Yeah, so that works. So maybe go through in this 15 minutes, kind of at least look through this section or two right here under intro and setting up your environments, basic Unix and shell. And then we'll run through it and make sure that we do that together and move on from there. And then we'll start to really get into the Git part of this whole thing. And maybe if we do well enough, by the end of this session, we'll begin to look at a branch that we can think about changing, and making our site better with some code that we can commit to Git, and seeing how Git uses that. So let's take about 10. Let's see, it's 10:44. Yeah, let's take about 15 and come back at 11. And Again, feel free to, is there any questions before we take that break?